This webinar continues our discussion of using Wikakchantan for achievement and oral language results to write the eligibility sections of your evaluation report. We will begin with writing up eligibility for this category of specific learning disabilities. The first area of SLD eligibility is inadequate achievement. Pause this webinar while you take time to review the sample scores again. What evidence is there for inadequate achievement? Looking at the standard scores for each cluster, anything below 90 is below average compared to the norm sample. It is recommended that we focus on specific clusters rather than broad scores. We should be identifying inadequate achievement in the specific areas of SLD eligibility, not just reading, writing, and math. You probably noted low scores in basic reading skills, reading comprehension, and math problem solving. We also note a weakness in spelling, but not in overall written language. Your discussion of whether the student is demonstrating inadequate achievement needs to include multiple sources of data. While we can use WJ scores to support the case of inadequate achievement, other data needs to be presented that is consistent with these test scores. As part of the inadequate achievement criteria, we need to describe a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that is relevant to the identification of a learning disability. Intra-achievement comparisons can help you determine relative strengths and weaknesses among academic skills. This pattern of strengths and weaknesses can be compared to the pattern of cognitive results and the pattern of academic performance in the classroom to support the conclusion of a specific learning disability. Consistent patterns increase the likelihood of a specific learning disability. The WJ scoring program will compare cluster scores to the average of all clusters and indicate when a cluster is significantly above or below average. They call this the intra-achievement comparisons. Remember that the average is based on the student's scores and may not tell us whether the overall skills in that area are above or below grade level expectations. This is just comparing the student to him or herself. If you look on page 4 of the score summary handout, you will see intra-achievement comparisons. Note that the expected score is the average of the other clusters minus the cluster you're predicting. So the predicted score for basic reading skills is the average of the other cluster scores, not including basic reading skills. This is a little bit misleading as you're always comparing to an average. This intra-achievement difference does not directly compare two clusters. For example, we note that this student's written expression score is 18 points higher than his math problem-solving score. Look at the actual column to see this. To us, that shows a notable, more than 15-point difference between writing and math problem-solving that we would mention. We would then say if we see a similar pattern in the classroom, and we would note if cognitive testing showed a difference between verbal and nonverbal reasoning, consistent with better written expression and weaker math problem solving. The next area of SLD eligibility is the discrepancy between cognitive ability and achievement. Here we will address the question of what scores we can use for determining discrepancy. We address this question in more detail in the test selection webinar. It is recommended to use the 8 cluster scores that most closely align with the 8 areas of SLD. This is recommended to prevent missing students who have a disability. The law and the Minnesota SLD manual do not say we can't use broad scores. If other data suggests the student has a disability, it would be acceptable to use the broad score if this captures the student's area of weakness. Remember to consult with your team, including your school psychologist, to ensure this makes sense for your student. It would also be acceptable to use the new written language cluster if this captures a spelling disability that is meaningfully impacting a student in the classroom. Next, we look at basic psychological processes. The WJ achievement is not definitive in measuring basic psychological processes because each subtest often requires multiple processes. However, you may start to see patterns in subtest scores that are measuring similar processes. For example, letter word ID and spelling both rely heavily on visual memory and auditory processing. Low scores in these areas may suggest a deficit in one of these processes. Similarly, when a student scores low in all the fluency subtests, this may suggest a weakness in processing speed. We strongly recommend that you take time to think about the subtest you administer and to consider the different processes involved in the test. We have provided a handout entitled The Relationship Between Achievement and Information Processing Ability to help with this. This can give you some good data to include in your write-ups for basic psychological processing and helps you to see some conditions as you're interpreting scores. The manual does tell you the primary processing skills measured by some of the tests, but it uses Cattell-Horn theory symbols, which may not match as nicely as you would like to the list above. Further, the manual will tell you that many subtests measure reading and writing knowledge, which isn't overly specific. Certainty in identifying weaknesses in basic psychological processing comes when multiple data sources point to the same weaknesses. Academic testing is one source among multiple sources of data we want to look at to draw conclusions about our student. We would compare academic scores to informal checklists, observations, and formal intellectual and/or language testing. For our sample student, we would report the speed of lexical access score from the oral language subtests in the basic psychological processing section of our report. You wouldn't necessarily give the subtests that compute this cluster, but this is an example of using supplemental tests to look at basic psych processing. This score indicates a student's ability to retrieve information from memory in a quick fashion and has been shown to impact a student's reading skills. Our student's low score is worth noting. Just an aside, identifying basic psychological processing deficits is a part of SLG criteria, and when we see clear deficits, it can tell us a lot about why students struggle and can help us predict where they might struggle in the future as task difficulty increases. However, you are not a neuropsychologist, and the impact of basic psychological processing on how we teach students is minimal. Do not stress about analyzing your students in every possible area of basic psychological processing. Look for patterns, point those out, and then look to see what accommodations your student might need to help compensate for these weaknesses. As mentioned in the presentation on test selection, initial evaluations for OHD and EBD require an individually administered test of achievement. Here we will likely want to administer fewer subtests. Looking at these scores, we can help determine if the student's inability to complete tasks in a timely fashion has led to unsatisfactory educational progress for OHD criteria. We can document whether the student's emotional or behavioral responses are adversely affecting the student's educational performance. There is no score cutoff for these areas, but rather we combine the test scores with classroom data to show below average skills or below average grades in the classroom. We want to end with a little more on avoiding score overload. If you look at page 3 of the score report we gave you, you will see a variety of other cluster scores that may be available based on the subtests you administered. The clusters are rarely helpful and often will restate what we already learned by reviewing the clusters on page 2. For example, the academic skills cluster and academic applications cluster lead to statements that show up in our reports like, the student's skills are in the low average range and his ability to apply these skills is in the borderline range. These general statements often hide the pattern of strengths and weaknesses. If the subtests within these clusters vary, say his letter word, ID, and spelling are worse than his calculation, to say all skills are low average is misleading at best and possibly just plain inaccurate. You may see something in the academic fluency cluster that supports that a student is a slow processor, but beyond that, it's hard to see a practical use for these cluster scores. Don't feel like you have to mention them just because they're there. With that, we hope you feel more prepared to include WJ scores in your description of the student you are evaluating. If you remember nothing else, remember that test scores are not the gospel truth and need to be interpreted in light of other data from the classroom to give us a complete picture of the student.